The envelope had waited 80 winters, 80 years of silence, 80 years of memory carried by a man who never once forgot the weight of a promise made in the snow. The old veteran stood at the end of the gravel path, breathing slowly as the cold wind brushed across the quiet countryside. His name, for the sake of this story, is Thomas Hale. Once, he had been 22 years old. Once he had worn the uniform of an infantryman in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and once, on a night when artillery shook the sky and men whispered prayers they hoped no one would hear, a fellow soldier had pressed an envelope into his hands. "Keep this safe," the young man had said. "If I don't make it, promise me you'll deliver it." Thomas had nodded, not because he believed the worst would happen, but because in war, promises between brothers carried more weight than medals. The soldier who gave him that envelope never saw another sunrise. His name in this reconstruction will be Daniel Carter, and for 80 years Thomas Hale carried a debt of honor that never faded. Today, standing before a quiet farmhouse in the early morning light, that debt was about to be paid. Inside that house lived a woman who had waited her entire life without knowing she was waiting. A daughter who had never met the man who wrote the letter, now trembling in Thomas Hale's hand. War had taken her father before she could speak his name, but war had not taken the promise of a brother. And now, after 8 decades of silence, the letter had finally come home. But to understand why that letter mattered so much, we must return to the coldest winter of the war. December 1944. The Ardennes forest had become a world of ice, mud, and uncertainty. For the soldiers stationed there, the cold was as relentless as the enemy. Thomas Hale and Daniel Carter had met only weeks earlier, 2 young men from different corners of America, different childhoods, different dreams, but war has a way of forging brotherhood faster than peace ever could. In the foxholes carved into frozen earth, they shared everything: cigarettes, rations, stories about the homes they hoped to return to. Daniel spoke often about his daughter, a baby girl who had been born just months before he shipped out. He carried her photograph inside a small leather wallet. Sometimes, in the dim light of a lantern, he would look at that photo with a quiet smile. "She'll probably be walking by the time I get home," he once said. Thomas remembered the way Daniel said it, not with arrogance, not with certainty, but with the stubborn hope only soldiers understand. Hope was a form of discipline. It was the thing that kept men moving through snow that swallowed their boots and fear that never quite left their bones. Days passed in tension. German artillery thundered across the forest. Columns of smoke rose behind distant tree lines. Rumors traveled through the ranks like winter wind. The enemy was advancing, and the men in those frozen foxholes understood something without needing to say it aloud. They were holding the line, not because they were the strongest, not because they were the elite few, but because duty had placed them there. And when duty calls, soldiers answer, even when the cost is everything. One night, as the forest fell into a tense silence between bombardments, Daniel Carter pulled an envelope from inside his jacket. It was sealed, carefully addressed, and worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. He handed it to Thomas. "If something happens to me," Daniel said quietly, "this goes to my daughter." Thomas looked at the envelope, then back at his friend. Neither of them liked speaking about death. But soldiers develop an unwavering moral compass when the world around them begins to break apart. Thomas nodded slowly. "You have my word." But neither of them knew that within hours, the promise would be tested in the most brutal way possible. The attack came before sunrise. The kind of violence that arrives without warning and turns a quiet forest into a storm of fire and steel. German artillery crashed through the treetops, shattering branches and sending splinters of frozen wood raining down on the soldiers below. Men scrambled from their foxholes. Rifles were raised. Orders were shouted through the chaos. Thomas Hale barely had time to pull his helmet down before the first wave of enemy infantry appeared between the trees. The battle that followed was confusion, courage, and fear, woven together in a matter of minutes. Snow erupted with every explosion. Machine gun fire tore through the silence of the forest. Some soldiers fought standing, others fought from their knees in the frozen mud. And in the middle of that storm, Daniel Carter fought like a man who knew exactly what he was protecting. Not medals, not glory, but the simple future of a daughter who deserved to know her father tried. At one point during the fighting, Thomas saw Daniel move forward to help another wounded soldier. It was instinct, brotherhood, the silent code that binds soldiers tighter than blood. Then the sound came, a single crack that cut through the noise. Daniel staggered. For a moment he stayed on his feet. Then he collapsed into the snow. Thomas reached him seconds later. The battle still raged around them, but in that small space between explosions, time seemed to slow. Daniel's breathing was shallow, his uniform darkened beneath him, and his eyes searched Thomas with the quiet understanding soldiers carry when they realize the end is near. "You promised," Daniel whispered. Thomas gripped his hand. "I remember." Daniel nodded once. Then the forest grew silent again, not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows sacrifice. Thomas stayed beside him for a moment longer, just long enough to close his friend's eyes. The envelope was still safe inside his jacket. And in that frozen forest surrounded by war, Thomas Hale made a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. He would not fail that promise. Not in 1 year, not in 20, not even in 80. The war eventually ended, like all wars do, suddenly, and then slowly. Thomas Hale returned home carrying the invisible weight shared by millions of veterans, memories that refused to fade, faces that appeared in dreams, and a letter that remained sealed. Years turned into decades. Thomas married, built a career, raised children of his own. But every winter when the air grew cold and the trees stood bare against gray skies, the Ardennes returned to him. And with them came the memory of Daniel Carter. The promise never left his mind. But life has a strange way of pulling soldiers in different directions once the uniform is folded away. Addresses were lost, families moved, records disappeared into dusty archives. Thomas searched more than once, quietly, without telling anyone, because debts of honor are not things soldiers boast about. They are burdens carried in silence. Then one day, long after most of the men from that frozen forest were gone, a small discovery changed everything. An old military record, a surviving family name, and the faint trail of a daughter who had grown up without ever hearing her father's voice. Her name, in this reconstruction, will be Emily Carter, and she was now 80 years old. The same age as the letter waiting in Thomas Hale's hands. Some promises take a lifetime to fulfill, others take longer. But the code of brotherhood never expires. So on a quiet winter morning, Thomas Hale finally decided the time had come. When the door opened, he suddenly felt 22 again, not because of strength, but because of the weight of memory pressing against his chest. The elderly woman standing before him studied his uniform cap, the faded military insignia, the trembling envelope in his hands. "My name is Thomas Hale," he said softly. "I served with your father." The words hung in the air. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Thomas extended the envelope. "This belongs to you." Emily Carter looked at it carefully. Her fingers brushed across the fragile paper as if touching something sacred. 80 years of silence rested between them. Finally, she asked the question that had lived in her heart her entire life. "Did he suffer?" Thomas shook his head gently. "No," he said. "He fought with courage. And he never stopped thinking about you." Tears filled her eyes as she opened the envelope. The letter inside had been written by a young man who believed he would return home. A father who dreamed of watching his daughter grow. A soldier who trusted a brother to carry his final words across time. Emily read it slowly, every line bridging the distance between past and present. When she finished, she looked up at Thomas. And for the first time in 80 years, the promise made in a frozen forest was finally complete. War had taken many things, but it had not taken honor. It had not taken brotherhood. And it had not taken the quiet discipline of a soldier who refused to forget. Because sometimes the greatest acts of courage do not happen in battle. Sometimes they happen 80 years later, when a silent hero finally delivers a letter that waited a lifetime to come home. If you are a veteran, or if you have someone in your family who served, please leave a simple thank you in the comments. Let's make this a wall of honor for those who never asked for one.